I'm not one to make lore videos, especially about Deltarune or Undertale. I like those games just fine, and they have a lot of very unique story ideas that no other author or creator really cares about going into to this extent. But while Deltarune has been pretty good so far, I would still only probably give it a 7 out of 10. And even I think that that's very low. However, for me, the saving grace of Deltarune is the Weird Route. Now, Chapter 5 has just come out, and there's a lot of ideas about where the Weird Route is going, or where it has gone, really, because as of this moment, the Weird Route is kind of done, or at least it's about to hit its climax when it has its final chapter. But whatever the story moments that are going to happen are, I think the emotional aspects are by far the most interesting. People like to really deep dive on the lore of what could be happening, especially since there's also some non-Weird Route stuff that's maybe tangentially connected to it, in connection to Chapter 3 in the video game side quests. There's a whole bunch of stuff with the Chapter 3 Dark World. And all that is very interesting. However, I think it's more interesting to address the bigger, more interesting aspect. Now, I don't know if I would call this emotional, but I want to address the fact that the game straight up tells you in very clear terms the gays are correct and the straights are wrong, basically. The route is going out of its way to make, maybe not sexual, of course, and maybe not necessarily romantic, but in my view, codependent vibes between Noelle and Chris. Codependency can be interpreted many ways, but we'll just stick with the most basic idea of it, which is that it's usually a situation in which one person is codependent on another, kind of like a parasite, but in reverse. The person who's codependent needs that other person to exist, but it's the host, let's say in this case, the person who is being depended on, who is the, let's say, toxic personality. In this way, I would actually say this is a portrayal of an abusive relationship. Now, obviously, it's an abusive relationship, but I mean a portrayal of a romantic relationship that is abusive, where Chris is portrayed as the cool, dangerous, badass guy who is mysterious and so interesting. You know, this is very much highlighted in Chapter 5 more than anywhere else. The previous routes are just highlighting how dangerous Chris is and how he's hurting Noelle emotionally and physically. But it's Chapter 5 in particular that mentions how it's almost as if she liked being manipulated. You made her life more interesting by doing everything that you've done. Now, this, of course, isn't like a normal straight relationship, of course, but you could view it as a dangerous teenage first relationship or something like that. Or, I mean, obviously it can happen in your 20s as well, but I think it's very appropriate to parallel it to a teenage relationship between a guy who just wants to use a girl for any number of reasons and a girl who just wants to be needed and relied upon or something in some way. Now, of course, the story is kind of let down in some ways by the fact that Chris doesn't speak too much. He does speak a little bit, but it's not very much. It's not much back and forth. He's a little bit too much of a dark, silent protagonist type of vibe. But I suppose he does say enough, and his actions are dramatic enough that it makes up for this lack of dialogue. I don't really know why they couldn't give Chris some more dialogue, but based on what we've seen, I think that there is plenty of show, don't tell aspects of the story in the Weird Route to make up for it. You never fully question what's happening. You understand well enough about the manipulation and the horror of certain situations. Definitely a lot of people were implying that chapter 4 could be paralleled to rape, or obviously the loss of innocence. And while I don't think chapter 5 fully portrays this, you can definitely understand that Noelle is 100% on Chris's side in chapter 5. So in that way, you could again say that she is now fully codependent on Chris to direct her life any way that he wants to. Now, you could also, from this point, extrapolate that when they go into the water and they both die, you could say, well, maybe Chris was suicidal and he drug her into his suicidal ideas and actions. That's definitely, reasonable to make that parallel. I personally don't view any of what happened in chapter 5 as suicide or drowning or anything like that. It was very clear that they were trying to get to the other side of the lake because, like she said, it didn't seem like an attainable place to go. Like it was outside the bounds of the video game itself. Now, she only kind of mentioned this in chapter 5. Before this, in chapter 2 and 4, I would have said that the point of the Weird Route was to defy fate, but not necessarily get a conclusion that you wanted. It was even said by... I forget which character. There's too many characters that could have said something. But like it was mentioned at one point that it might not lead to a ending that would actually be better. Maybe it's better to follow fate and get a better ending than to defy fate and get a worse ending. In this way, actually, you could even make this equivalent to, is it better to serve in heaven or rule in hell or something like that, where it's like, okay, you got what you wanted, but you're suffering, versus you could have not gotten what you wanted, but been perfectly happy. And then, of course, there's the whole aspect where Chris doesn't actually care about Noelle at the end of the day. Or, doesn't care about her that way, I should say. At most, they were friends in the past, just very platonic. And going by the normal route, he doesn't seem like he really has strong feelings one way or the other toward Noelle. Just that's my own personal interpretation. But with the Weird Route, Chris sees an opportunity to affect change in the world. Now, whether this is a video game inside the video game, I've heard many theories. I'm not going to get into them here, but the point is that Chris could use her to escape what he viewed as a fate that he did not want any part of. There has been some mention about how I think it was Onion-chan was talking about there was darkness at the bottom of the lake, and that makes it pretty clear to me that they probably went into the Dark World when they went into the water. My interpretation of this is that the darkness at the bottom of the lake is connected to the bunker, and so they went into the bunker early, and that's why it says Chapter 7, Side B. We're going to go to the bunker in Chapter 7, and this is either happening parallel or explains things that will happen in Chapter 7. Probably backstory, more than likely. I'd be surprised if the Weird Route was that long in Chapter 7. I predict probably just 1 hour, maybe less. But I'll give it credit and say 1 hour. I struggle to think of any long gameplay actions happening. It just feels like it would be a lot of crazy cutscenes, crazy lore type stuff. Unclear how they fall into the roaring. I do want to throw out there, I have just today heard a theory that maybe the Weird Route all leads to Chris and Noelle combining into one entity, and they are the Roaring Knight, which is an interesting idea. You could say, well, you see the antlers on the Roaring Knight, and you see a big sword, so this is kind of a combination of both of their bodies to some extent. I don't think I believe it, only based on current information. It seems like an interesting idea, but what could possibly be the explanation for that? Either they accidentally combined, and in their desperation they believe that creating the roaring would somehow solve something. It's too vague. It's it could be that. I just think that even in the most vague story points, Toby Fox does a good job of giving a reasonable path to understand the story. There can be some vague stuff, but you do understand at least one or two possible interpretations of what's happening. Too many other games will be way too vague, and then you're like, okay, I really don't know what's going on here. And it feels like with other games you might get some incomplete lore, kind of not plot holes, but lore holes, basically, that don't completely fit some big twist that the game wants you to believe. But as of right now, I would say that they will confront Gaster. I know this is kind of generic. I mean, it does seem unlikely anybody would meet Gaster at this point, but there is some indications that this is all being done by Gaster, but you could also say that that's the same thing with Undertale, so it is very difficult to guess if Gaster would even be involved in the actual plot of the story without, going out of your way. But, Weird Route's going out of its way to do everything it's doing, so I could definitely see them being outside the flow of time and space, being the Roaring Knight, but I don't think that would actually lead the story in a better direction to just say, they just became the Roaring Knight, and everything about Des just died, and everybody just feels guilty about that, and this story is just a story about the loss of a loved one, and it's like, that is interesting, I will admit. But I still think the Roaring Knight being Des would be a lot more interesting than saying that, it's actually some weird timey-wimey parallel dimension, multiple path type thing. It's like, do we know why Sans is powerful? No. Is it important? No. At the end of the day, he's a guy who wants peace. He's powerful. You beat him in Undertale. That's all you need to know about him, really. Whereas giving this whole overly complicated backstory for the Roaring Knight just doesn't feel like it's going to be satisfying. Now, if it's just death, then it feels like you could go somewhere with that interpretation. Whether it's that she's a ghost who wants things to go back to the way they were before, or whether there's some connection with her and Asriel. Maybe her and Asriel were going to be the original heroes, but then they ended up losing one of their members, the Darkner, I suppose, maybe in this case. And in their desperation or in their grief, as maybe Des combines with the Darkner, and then that's why she looks like that, and why she has powers that no other Darkner has. And then Asriel was just like, what the heck? I don't know what to do. Like he doesn't, she just seems dead and crazy or something. So he just goes to college and he's like, I don't know what to do, so I'll just get out of here. I hope that that's the direction they go. I literally just spitballed that right this second, and it feels a lot more satisfying than, well, actually, they're going to combine Chris and Noelle, and somehow them being the Roaring Knight is going to be a lot more satisfying. Trust me, bro. Like, I don't know. But it would, to be fair, that does actually make sense with why the Roaring Knight would be like working with Chris, since they would be the same entity, whereas them working with Chris as Des or a Darkner or whatever doesn't make sense. But again, we don't know enough about Chris himself. We don't know where he learned how to make fountains. We don't know the relationship about exactly what's going on between the soul inside Chris and Chris himself. So, there's a lot of directions we can go in. It's just, the game has to start actually addressing more story points. I mean, I suppose they can really address almost all the story points in 2 hours. It just seems like it'd be really rushed if they did that. Obviously, there's going to be a lot to talk about when it comes to Rouse and Susie in Chapter 6. Will they do it in Chapter 6? Who knows? They could talk about a familial abuse or something when it comes to Susie. But who knows if they'll actually have a real conversation about that, or if it'll just be, that was a heartfelt 5 minutes and she got over it, and don't worry, whatever, we got to go beat the Roaring Knight and stop the roaring, and we'll deal with your family issues in the epilogue, maybe. Like, please don't do this, It's like, how about we just have this be the actual story, we actually address these things during the game. Which they could have, Remember, Susie was doing all that bullying at the beginning of Chapter 1, and then the realness of that scene never gets properly returned to. There are some serious moments, but it definitely feels more like fantasy RPG elements rather than heartfelt, real, emotional experiences that a human actually had, at least that's how I interpret it. But yeah, I just wanted to go over this a little bit, just partly to get my thoughts together, and partly because while this channel does focus on anime, it also should be more about analyzing good stories in general, in my opinion. The more I've thought of things, the more I'm like, yeah, you know what? I should be able to talk about just small little story points like this more and more. But yeah, there's a lot of things that Deltarune still has left to tell us, and I can't wait to find out. I just don't want it to go in a direction that I don't like. How and what a crazy idea. But I'm confident that Toby knows what he's doing, and even if it does go in a direction I wouldn't prefer, I don't think it's going to be done in a bad way or anything like that. But yes, thanks for watching. Check out my Patreon, and I'll see you next time. See ya.